Welcome to Frontlines of Social Good, the weekly news and views program from the Philanthropy Mastermind series. I'm Jay Frost. Today, we are marking a milestone. This is our final Frontlines episode of the year, the first year of this program. We'll begin with the top 5 gifts of the week, and then take a look at the headlines shaping philanthropy, fundraising, and social impact. Later, we'll dive into a major strategic shift underway in institutional philanthropy, spending down foundation assets. Joining us is Glenn Galich, CEO of the Stupski Foundation, an organization that has embraced a time-limited approach to ensure resources are deployed now when they can make the greatest possible difference. Glenn has become one of the sector's clearest voices on what it takes for foundations to wind down with purpose, partnership, and urgency. We'll explore what's driving this trend, how some foundations are centering community and equity in their final distributions, and what nonprofit leaders should know as more funders move towards sunset models. Let's get started. Here are the top 5 gifts of the week. Number 5, over $1 billion in Alphabet Inc. stock to Catalyst 4 by the organization's founder and Google co-founder Sergey Brin. Number 4, $150 million from the Bill Gatton Foundation to the University of Kentucky to build a new arts district, the largest gift in the university's history. The investment will support construction of a new College of Fine Arts building and a several hundred-seat theater, substantially expanding the university's arts and cultural footprint. Number 3, $80 million in pledges to Central Michigan University College of Medicine from its partners Covenant Healthcare and My Michigan Health. 2 commitments of $40 million each to support construction of a new medical education facility in Saginaw, Michigan. These gifts, which are the largest in CMU's history, will transform medical education capacity in the region. Number 2, an anonymous gift of approximately $50 million to UW-Medicine to cover tuition for all seniors in the Medical Laboratory Science program during their clinical rotations in perpetuity. The funding will also enable expansion of the program's capacity from 70 to 100 students over the next 10 years, helping address critical shortages in clinical laboratory professionals. And number 1 this week, $40 million from Mackenzie Scott to the Jed Foundation, the largest single contribution in that organization's history. The unrestricted gift arrives nearly 4 years after Ms. Scott made a $15 million donation to the organization. The gift will strengthen the foundation's capacity to expand mental health support services, increase access to care, and bolster efforts to improve behavioral and emotional well-being for young people nationwide. Have we missed a big gift announcement this week? I'm certain that we have. Let us know by contacting me directly through LinkedIn or by email at j@donorsearch.net. Now for our top stories of the week. We begin by revisiting Giving Tuesday, which was just, of course, last Tuesday, and once again broke records. According to the Associated Press, Americans donated an estimated $4 billion to nonprofits on Giving Tuesday, up from $3.6 billion in the prior year of 2024. The Giving Tuesday Data Commons estimates that 38.1 million people in the U.S. participated this year, a 13% increase in dollars and a 6% increase in participants compared to 2024. Bringing cumulative Giving Tuesday donations since 2012, its year of origin, to about $22.5 billion. Of those participants, roughly 19.1 million made financial contributions, 13.5 gave goods, and 11.1 million volunteered, with volunteering up 20% over the last year. The Giving Tuesday estimates exclude corporate and foundation gifts, so these totals reflect everyday donors rather than mega givers. In other news, and specifically mega giver news, billionaires Michael and Susan Dell have committed $6.25 billion to help fund a new generation of child investment accounts under the Federal Interest America Initiative, or rather the Federal Invest America Initiative, sometimes nicknamed Trump accounts. Under the government program, every child born in the U.S. between 2025 and 2028 will receive a $1,000 contribution from the U.S. Treasury into an Invest America account, a tax-advantaged market invested savings intended for education, job training, a first home, or starting a business once the child turns 18. The Dells Pledge adds $250 each for 25 million additional children, primarily those under age 10, who were born before 2025 and therefore do not qualify for the government's $1,000 seed deposit. Their commitment is rooted through the Invest America Charitable Foundation, which is working with the Treasury Department to launch the accounts. The program is scheduled to go live around July 4th. Critics have noted that the broader tax and spending package that created the program also contains cuts to safety net programs, raising questions about whether long-term investment accounts can offset immediate losses in Medicaid, food assistance, and childcare. Moving on, Charity Navigator and Giving Compass have announced the launch of Horizon AI Search, which they describe as a new, quote, intelligent nonprofit search experience. According to the announcement, the tool combines Charity Navigator's rating system with Giving Compass's natural language search API, allowing donors to type conversational queries such as nonprofits fighting climate change in California or large organizations helping homeless veterans, and receive results ranked by relevance and intent, not just keyword matches. Leaders from both of these organizations have described this as an attempt to make philanthropy what they say is a more human, modern, and trustworthy experience for donors who are overwhelmed by choice and skeptical about impact. At the same time, some critics have pointed to the presence of a giving basket feature within the application, which reminds them of the recent GoFundMe controversy we covered earlier in this program. Craig Newmark, founder of Craigslist, a service and probably a name that you're very familiar with, announced this week on LinkedIn that he has formally signed the Giving Pledge, the public commitment by ultra-wealthy individuals to give away at least half their fortunes. In his post, Newmark underscores that he has, quote, never been a billionaire, in part because he gave away all his Craigslist equity to his charitable foundation years ago. And he notes that in late 1990s, he deliberately chose to monetize the company as little as possible, turning down an estimated $11 billion that bankers and venture capitalists, as he says, wanted to throw at him. Newmark frames the pledge less as altruism and more as fidelity to a moral compass shaped early by Sunday school teachers who taught him to know when enough is enough and to be his brothers and sisters' keeper. He wrote that he plans to give away most of, or rather, to give most all of it away, keeping only a small portion for family, and outlines a focus on military families and veterans, fighting cyber attacks and scams, and even a bit for pigeon rescue. I think that's a new one for this program. Meanwhile, we're also seeing how stock market surges are quietly transforming the scale of private foundations. Due to NVIDIA's extraordinary rally, the assets of the Jen Shun and Laura Huang Foundation have soared to roughly $9.2 billion, a 170% increase in 2024 alone, according to reporting summarized by Candid's Philanthropy News Digest and related coverage. The foundation was seeded with NVIDIA stock and has grown from around $828 million in assets 5 years ago to, again, over $9.1 to $9.2 billion today, thanks largely to the company's rise to a $4 trillion market valuation. Because U.S. private foundations are required to distribute at least 5% of their assets annually, calculated in the prior year's average value, that asset growth has immediate payout implications. Analysis by Foundation Mark, cited in recent coverage, estimates that the Huang's foundation needed to distribute about $123 million in 2024 and will have to give roughly $369 million this year if its current valuation holds, nearly tripling its annual giving obligation in a very short amount of time. A well-known grant-making giant, the Lilly Endowment, Inc., has now become the first private U.S. foundation to hit roughly $100 billion in assets, another story that matches this theme and we'll be covering in a moment in this report. Driven by a surge in the stock of pharmaceutical company Eli Lilly and Company, of which the endowment is the largest shareholder, their assets totaled about $21 billion as recently as the end of 2020, according to their own financial reports and independent analyses, meaning the endowment's value has grown nearly five-fold in just a few years. The endowment holds roughly 92.5 million Eli Lilly shares, based on recent SEC filings, a concentration that has supercharged its asset base as the company's market capitalization climbed past $1 trillion on the back of blockbuster weight loss and diabetes drugs. As commentators have noted, this stock-driven surge has propelled Lilly Endowment past the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, whose endowment is around $77 billion, making Lilly the largest private foundation in the United States by assets. At a 5% payout rate, a $100 billion endowment implies around $5 billion a year in required grant making, a figure on par with many national public sector budgets. Taken together, these stories sketch a philanthropy landscape being reshaped at both ends. Tens of millions of people giving and volunteering on days like Giving Tuesday, while a handful of tech-aligned fortunes and stock-driven foundations wield unprecedented financial power. To shed greater light on the philanthropic decisions now facing great fortunes and large foundations in a time of great need, we turn to Glenn Galich, CEO of the Stupski Foundation. He shares what it means to decide to spend down a large foundation's assets deliberately, what that choice says about power and accountability in philanthropy, and how time-limited philanthropy might change the way we think about impact itself. Here is that conversation. Glenn, thank you very much for taking time to talk today. It's a pleasure to see you.
Well, it's wonderful to be here, and thank you so much for the invitation.
There's so much we could talk about, but I know one thing that you focused on a lot, at least in your LinkedIn posts and your podcast, other places, has been kind of the pressures created by the government in doing what it's doing, and especially taking money out of the system.
Right.
That's supporting the social sector, and then how the foundation sector has responded to that. And before we jump into that, I should let you do a little self-definition here. People may have heard of you and the Stupski Foundation, but they may not really know what you do or what you focus on. Can you tell us a little bit about the foundation?
Yeah, I'm sure it's confusing because if you go to our website, what you'll see is the core of what we do. We work in, well, first of all, we are a spend down foundation. So if people are familiar with the private foundation world, most of the foundations you see have built into their bylaws and or practices a desire to live forever. Forever. To do that, it requires that you make more money than you give away every year. So it's a very simple formula. So your goal is to give the lowest amount you can possibly give so that you can make enough to go on and on and on. So that's not what we are. Our founder made the decision. Their names were Joyce and Larry Stupski. Larry was the mind and energy behind turning Charles Schwab from a boutique stock firm into an international brand that I'm sure many are familiar with. So he did well. And they immediately got into philanthropy. And Larry passed away in 2013, and Joyce decided we're going to spend it all out. At the time, the foundation was $250 million in size. And then when she passed away in 2021, all of their entire assets went into the foundation to be given away. There will be no financial legacy of this family once we spend out the assets of the foundation, which we will complete pretty much at the end of 2027. We'll have a little bit left in 28 and 29, and then it's up to the state of California to give us the okay to shut our doors because we're based in the Bay Area in California.
Wow.
So we work, just to finish your question out, the answer to it, we work in the Bay Area and Hawaii. We work in 2 counties in the Bay Area. And our 4 issue areas are early brain development, food justice. We have a big program in post-secondary success. And then we have a serious illness care program. And all 4 of those areas focus very much on racial equity and justice. So we really try to address historic, systemic, and structural racist issues. So then, on top of that, we've learned a lot as a spend down. And, some of the practices that you see in the foundation world, we find to be very contradictory to the missions and efforts that we have in the sector. And so we are very vocal about that. And we are trying, using whatever voice we have as a foundation, to encourage, we'll put it that way, our peers and their founders to do more. And so some people know us strictly as that. They're like, what is this creature that's out there calling on all this change? But we do have a very active and very successful grant making program that's coming to a close in a couple of years.
So many questions about all of that, but that's remarkable because where are your assets now? How much is there that you have to give away?
That's a great question. If my finance director hears this, she's going to say, see, you don't read the reports enough. But I believe we're down to about 70 million now. We have, most of it is tied up in operational assets to pay out all of our salaries and everything as we close. As far as grant making goes, we've got about another 35 million left.
And where did you start? I mean, from the time that she passed and then the assets went in, it was at 250 already.
So when it's all said and done, in the time I've been at the foundation, I've been at the foundation for 10 years. Mm-hmm. When we're done, over my leadership period, we will have spent out $600 million. Now, here's the difference between a spend down and a 5% foundation. In that time, if we had stayed 5%, we would have moved 150 million.
And you'd be where in terms of assets?
We would probably, we've had, there were years where we moved $25 million and we made it all back. Those were in years where we were invested in the market. I divested us out in 2022 because I just felt it was highly contradictory to our mission. That's a whole other conversation. But in those years where we were and we're not just in the markets, by the way, foundations get access to extraordinary investment opportunities. So we're in hedge funds. We had Grand Cayman Island accounts. We had speculation in real estate, casinos. The foundations are not in pretty stuff. And so that's why it returns a lot of capital. Where it comes from, who it extracts it from, turns out to be very similar demographics to the people you're trying to help, interestingly. So if we'd stayed on that track and we were not, that's an interesting question. It's an estimate, but I'd say we probably would be up around 500 million right now, I would guess.
Wow. I'm kind of stunned also the portfolio that keeps the wheels turning in most foundation settings. And without thinking about the ethics of that for a moment and just thinking about the dollars and cents.
Yeah.
We're not talking about 8% and then paying out 5%. Like it would be if you were an investor at TIAA CREF for retirement. This is
right.
Potentially much more significant return and then trying to pay down 5%.
For sure. So what anyone will tell you in the foundation investment world is we're trying to average above 5%. Right? Because we're going to have these years, but of course, none of this plays out that way. But let's say that's what they're trying to do. Mm-hmm. So then when they have a 16% or a 12% or a 9% year, I mean, this year has been incredibly lucrative. I don't know if you saw the story yesterday. I can't remember who reported it, but the very wealthy of the world made some unbelievable amount more money this last year, a year that will likely be the beginning of a very difficult run for what has already been a very difficult run for working families is going to get just much more difficult in 2026. This was an incredible year of gain for foundations and for wealthy people. So you're right. You have these years that are just way outside of what the 5% will be. Now, the interesting part is when foundations hit a year where they're at 3 or 4%, so they have a bad investment year, they will most likely reduce their giving to the degree they possibly can to ensure that they haven't lost anything in a given year.
Right. And I understand that there's also another dimension, which is that for foundations which do not have a spend down philosophy, that they also are able to utilize the expenses. And it costs something to run a foundation. I'm not criticizing Absolutely. That. But the costs of running it also can come out of that 5%. Isn't that correct?
That's right. Yeah. So there are so many aspects to this when you really start to put your mind to it. The interesting piece, and I'll just start from this one point, is that we don't talk about this aspect much in the foundation sector. We talk a lot about the 5% or as you just properly said, what could be 3% that we give away in grants because the rest is in operations. We talk about that like crazy. Every conference you see in philanthropy focuses on the 5%. We don't call it that. We don't refer to it that way. Who wants to? I mean, you don't want to go to work every day saying, I'm so excited, I'm going to give away some small percentage of the 5% of the foundation's assets this year. No one wants to say that, but that's what we do. We never talk about the 95. We never talk about any of that stuff. We do talk about impact investing, which is often a small carve out of the 95%, meaning there might be 10% of that 95. It might be, on the high side, 20%. But even those impact investments, take a close look at them. They're not all impact all the time.
Well, and they are investments.
That they are. And you're trying to, you want to earn back. And so you meet a lot of impact investment organizations, and I believe heavily in this idea. And I so hope that this succeeds at some point and that we see a more sustainable economy. So I hope no one takes this as a slight on anyone trying to do something good. But often in the conversations I have with impact investment minded people, they've figured out the financial part, still working on the impact side.
Yeah. Wow. I have to ask you how you came to be involved. This is 10 years on. So how did you find a marriage of philosophy and decide to join and pursue this together?
It's funny. I was, so for the few years before Stupski, I ran an organization called the Philanthropy Workshop. It has now been renamed Forward Global. And we were training donors on how to give money, and so much credit to those people because they really were living it and still do. Many of them that I had the great opportunity to work with are still out there, individual donors working hard to figure out how to give money well. And at some point I said to myself, I've never given a grant before. I should probably do that. Because I don't know if I'm really telling these people the right thing or not. So I went to a recruiter and just said, do you think I could get a job as an executive at a foundation? And he said, you're not going to believe it, but I think I've got your job right now. And 60 days later, I was working for Joyce Stupski.
Wow.
So it was, and a lot of, she was, from the start, obviously unique. She was doing something that very few foundations do. She wanted to spend it all out. She wanted to have as much impact as she could possibly have. I was drawn to that for sure. So that's where it started.
One of the other things that strikes me as you talk about this is, of course, the family being the people behind Schwab, which, as you said, everybody recognizes that name. One of the ways we recognize it today is not just for investment, but also for donor advised funds. And the whole purpose there, of course, is to make it possible for people to give. You can put your money in today and take that tax deduction today, and then you could give it all away tomorrow, or you could just let it sit there indefinitely. And there are arguments both directions. I want to be fair about this, that NPT has said that in the aggregate, 20% of the money is given away every year. That's much more than the 5% we were talking about before. But there are also criticisms of people saying that some of that money rarely leaves the coffers. It depends on where and whose, but that's very interesting to see that the family that at least has their name associated with DAFs, which are set up to be like mini family foundations in a sense,
they are,
is very different from the idea that the family itself had to spend all this money for the public good.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's really interesting. And interestingly, too, we do not have a DAF at Schwab. We do use a DAF at San Francisco Foundation, but we don't have one at Schwab. I don't know what Joyce's reasons were. So much of our infrastructure today was really built by Joyce and Larry before that. And they set up these different financial channels from our investments to our donor advised fund, and they chose not to go that direction. Yes, there is a lot we could talk about with donor advised funds. I don't want to divert that, but that is a great topic. I would love to come back to that anytime.
Sure. Well, and you talked about the things that you're supporting now, which sounds like they've been consistent over time since she was with you and he was there, but to today when both of them are gone and you're carrying on the mission of the foundation as well as the payout intentions. So has much of that changed a bit, where not only what you support through the spend down, but also where?
Well, so just to be clear, because there may be people that recognize a version of the Stupsky Foundation that's not the one you're hearing now. And when Larry was alive, they co-chaired the foundation, and it was an operating foundation, so it was huge. It was with consultants and staff involved. I think at one point it was up around 120 people, and they were working on education reform across the country, and they approached it in several different ways. But I think in the end, Larry, even in his dying days, in his last conversations with Joyce, they both agreed that that model didn't work for them. Didn't feel like the operating model was the one. I think some good things came out of it. There were some tremendously talented leaders that preceded me, names that are well known in the philanthropy world, some that are running foundations today, peers of mine. I'm very proud to have succeeded them. But Joyce wanted to go a very different direction. So what I have described today is more the Stupsky Foundation under Joyce. And in that time, to answer your question, we have gone through changes. Our issue areas have remained the same, but our mindset, our approach, our culture, and our values have shifted a lot. And I would say primarily from one that's centered more on Joyce's vision and what Joyce wanted and what resonated with her, to more toward what the community ultimately wants from a foundation, which are, these assets are quasi-public assets in the sense that we as Americans subsidize these foundations to the tune of 40 to 70% tax exemption. And then the assets are used, and they're supposed to be used for public benefit, but oftentimes are used for what the donors think and what the donor wants in most cases. When in fact the donor to the foundation, there's really no relationship other than the check that has been written. But we oftentimes, almost always, put the donor on the board, usually as the chair, and then they do the giving they want to do. And even the media, when we report on philanthropic media, not just New York Times, which is, typically catching up on what's going on in philanthropy, but the folks that are on it every day, like yourself, we refer to these gifts that come out of foundations often as the donor giving a gift in the moment. I'll just look at the news last night, right? Last night, not to date us too much here, but last night, the Dells gave $6 billion. Well, that came out, I'm guessing, I haven't looked at the details, but I'm assuming that came from the Dell Foundation, not the Dells. The Dells made a big grant to the Dell Foundation. It's no longer their money. They have no involvement other than they sit in governance of the organization. So it would be like, saying that any organization you've ever seen that has a board, when that organization does something, we have to credit the chair for what they've done, not the organization itself. And we do that in the media constantly. George Soros gave this person gave. The Dells gave several $1 billion to a foundation that happens to also have their name on it, and they govern it. But the money is actually a tax-exempted structure that they are publicly stewarding, not privately stewarding. So we really took that to heart and tried to, without going into a lot of detail, restructure ourselves so that the communities with whom we work have much more involvement in many different ways, either in the staff that we have on board and or the processes and practices we engage in. And sadly, Joyce has not been around to see it, but she was one of the biggest champions of this. I look back on it and I realize we were doing all these things in the roles that staff typically play at foundations, honoring her, and she was the one pushing us the most to honor communities. And we didn't really get that. At least I didn't. I'll take credit. I did not get that until we had lost her. She was no longer with us.
A lot of this really does speak to something else that's been a big part of the discussion for the last few years, and that's community-centered philanthropy. I mean, It's often talked about in terms of fundraising specifically, but this whole idea about having people who represent all the communities of interest on the staff or on the board, it depends on the structure of the entity, it is so important. It's kind of central to it, but you've been doing it, or you and your colleagues, the foundation, have been doing this for a while. But also the landscape has changed a little bit in terms of the needs, hasn't it? I mean, while the primary focus areas remained, if not anything, have grown over time. The specific needs of the community may have altered a little bit because the government's retrenchment. Have you seen a difference in how you and your colleagues approach the spend down in light of what's happened in the last, especially the last, what is it? Is it 11 months now?
Yeah, 11 months. We've definitely reacted to it. We were on a particular trajectory. You know, we mapped out the glide path to shutting down, and we basically agreed. The board gave us an allocation of capital this year. This gets so in the weeds, I don't want to go that far, so I'm trying to figure out how to keep it up a level. But they basically gave us an allocation of capital, about $35 million, which for us was a pretty decent amount of money. Mm-hmm. On top of the budgets that we already, the program teams already had. So just to be clear, I do not make I make very few grants at the foundation, and I have very little role in our grant making. It's done at the program officer and director level. They're outstanding. If you love anything Stupsky does, they're the people. And so they were given an allocation by the board that was intended to run for the final 3 years of our time. So from 25, 6, and 7. And they decided to move it all this year. So as a result, we use 75% of our entire remaining grant-making capital. So compare that to some other foundation. Many other foundations are now moving at 5% payouts. Mm-hmm. Some are celebrating their increase of 1% more in this crisis. Some have gone so far as 2%. So they're giving 6 to 7%. And believe me, whether they'll tell you this or not, these are friends, and we have a very healthy disagreement, so they have a good argument back at me. They have done that with full understanding from their investment teams that they can weather that in perpetuity. So if you hear what if you kind of dig into what I'm mm-hmm. saying, that is a donor-centered approach to giving. That is being unresponsive, in my opinion. And there's great literature out there that counters back at me. Lots of people worried about future problems. A lot of foundations are very focused on things that are going to happen way out there that we can't see. They're less concerned about things today. And they give with the perpetual mindset from a donor-centered approach. And I can tell you, if you ask a community member, just ask anybody. If you sit I'm sure you're involved with lots of community organizations. If a donor came to you and said, how about if I give you 5 cents instead of $1? What would your answer be? It's going to be, we're going to need more than 5 cents, bro. So that is where we try to come from. We are trying, grantees are caught in a very challenging place because you've got to coddle to the egos of these foundations. So it's not easy to go to one and say, here's what we really need if you want to change the world. You go in with it, because I've been in fundraising, and I can tell you go to those organizations, you've gone through their entire giving history, and you know what they're willing to give. And you want to hit them at that number. Well, it's going to be pennies on what you really need, but it's something at least. So we felt on our end that we weren't going to wait around for people to come and ask us. We were just going to move it. And I'm asking other foundations to take that same approach.
Yes, and that's money, where I wanted to ask you what kind of reaction you're getting to that. I mean, because some of your statements are in front of not just the community. Oftentimes, foundations they're communicating with one another because you're colleagues, but they aren't necessarily communicating with the rest of us in a big way. But you are very much just talking about these issues publicly. So, what kind of reaction are you getting, both within and from without?
I've got good friends, and we talk all the time, and they're the ones you see liking the posts on LinkedIn. So you're going to see Carmen Rojas popping on there from Marguerite Casey, and Jamie Allison from Haas Senior, and who I posted something the other day, and I was like, oh, look who's here. So there are different people, but the ones that I'm not naming and talking about never ever acknowledge me on LinkedIn, and I know they see me, and I know they hear me. But they don't. And we have a podcast as well, which is, I don't know if it's showing up here, but we have a podcast called Break Fake Rules, and we've had a lot of foundation leaders on it. And I'm pushed all the time in comments like, why don't you bring on some of the folks who are not breaking fake rules? And I think we need to do that. I think it would be healthy to hear from them on why they aren't moving in this time. So I don't hear much. There's certain posts I put out where I just know there's not going to be any response, or newsletters will put out where I can see that there's not going to be a response. But I know it's out there. I'm hopeful that at some point we can engage each other more.
And that's the kind of the public conversation. But am I right that there are also times when you have these conversations privately, and without naming names or anything? Mm-hmm. What are some of the reactions beyond we need to prepare for the future, which is it's a legitimate argument, even if it's not one that you or I might agree with. It is an mm-hmm. argument, and
sure,
there could be a benefit to making it on your podcast or somewhere else so people would understand that better. But putting that aside,
yeah,
when you just say, hey, this is a different time than it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago. So we really need to get more people behind spending down right now because the government has done X, Y, and Z. What are they saying to you privately?
It's interesting. I think there's a lot of interest and openness at the staff level, and they are reporting to a board of trustees. I don't often get the opportunity to talk to the trustees, and the trustees don't often show up. They tend to, by show up, I mean in even small meetings, private sessions. I have been asked on several occasions to come and talk to boards by staff who feel they can't get the message across, and they're going to bring in the rabble rouser to do it. And you will find that there are family members. So there's disagreements amongst family members, right? And so staff will oftentimes align with the more forward-looking, more flexible, more willing family members. Which, by the way, it might surprise you to hear. I just have started to take note of this. There's a lot of hope on the next generation of people coming up, but I have come across just in this last year a couple of families where the next generation is digging in even harder on traditions, and the older generation is looking to do some new things. So
wow, that's interesting. So where do you think?
I know. Believe me, it spun me around upside down and over.
Where's that coming from? Where's that coming from?
It could just be a unique couple families, but it was surprising to me. It's been so I can't count on the next gen. It's usually a next gen. Okay. And the next gen goes to the staff and says, hey, let's try to move. Who can you bring in for that? And I'll come in and talk. And I've seen some move to spend down after a conversation. I've seen some decide they're going to give more. And by the way, there is a wide gulf between perpetuity and spending down. There's so many options in there. And that, more than anything, is what I want. I'm eagerly encouraging my peers and their bosses, the trustees, to just explore the options. One in particular that I always, Carmen, who I mentioned earlier, they made a decision to move an additional $175 million this year out of their $1 billion endowment, which is pretty extraordinary. And she said to me right before she did it, if we end up being a $750 million foundation, that's fine. It is. So you end up just resetting your perpetuity lens at $750 million, and you move $250 right now. That's incredible. What a difference that's going to make for the groups that they support. So yeah, I think there's a willingness at the staff level, but the trustees and the boards really, really need to come along, and that's where the power is. That's where the control is.
Glenn, I want to ask you, you mentioned this thing about generational, and sometimes we have these perceptions. I had it too, that next gen might be more flexible or think about the money differently. But another aspect is just foundations which exist, which have mm-hmm. those generational differences, but there are also new entities or just new donors who maybe don't have a foundation yet. And,
yeah.
Mackenzie Scott is the one we're going to all talk about because of the nature right. of how she's been giving. and giving directly, and the difficulty she's had in giving it all away. But we can get there in a second. But are you seeing that with the people who are coming into their wealth now or creating wealth today, that there are some differences in how they're approaching these matters and what they think their responsibilities might be?
Yeah, that's a hard call. I'm not sure. I mean, we're talking about all kinds of different profiles and archetypes here too. You know, when you talk about, but yesterday David Fahrenthold in the New York Times had yet another piece about Elon Musk, and if he is to be the wealthiest man in the world, he certainly isn't showing us anything positive about philanthropy. In fact, he and many of his tech brethren have actually said we don't need to be philanthropists because the technology we provide, this was famously Andreessen's comment, the technology we provide is so incredible, will change so many lives for the good. We don't need to be philanthropists because they're going to do so much more in our daily lives. So that is not a good sign for the world of philanthropy. So yeah, it's just a range, Jay. It's hard for me to really pinpoint any particular thing. I want to be hopeful that we're going to see some changes, but I think there's no time like the present to try it. The one thing we haven't talked about, which is that I'm most focused on, is how this perpetual argument loses even more traction, in my opinion, when you consider that between now and the next couple decades, if we don't change our practices, if we don't give away more, we're going to see the charitable coffers grow to $18 trillion. It's only at $2 trillion right now. So we're going to have warehoused all this charitable money to the tune of upwards of $18 trillion. That's 2 times the size federal budget. I mean, when are we going to move this? And people will celebrate. They'll say, well, at 18 trillion, if you take 5% of that, you're talking money here.
So where's the 18 trillion coming from? First of all,
this is the great, this is the transition in wealth that's happening, the transfer.
Right.
And so a lot of these, your question is a good one. And believe me, we're all watching. What will the next generation do that inherits this wealth? I've seen some great examples of young people who have said, we don't want to have a foundation. We're just going to move the money now. And there's a good argument to be made to not move it into a foundation because a friend of mine, Ludovic Blaine, always says that there's no such thing as an unrestricted foundation grant, because the minute you put it in a foundation, it becomes incredibly restricted. The only benefit is to the donor, the tax benefit. But in terms of the recipient, you can't lobby, you can't advocate, you can't build buildings. There's a whole bunch of things you can't do with C3 money. Better to just leave it out and use it in any form you can, C4, C3, PAC, whatever, LLC. And a lot of donors are trying that. And I think hopefully we're going to see some of that experimentation with the next generation.
Is there anything that perhaps a different administration might pursue in order to create the kind of structures which would encourage or at least facilitate people's ability to distribute wealth that they are at least inheriting, if not making? In other words, are there structural pieces that government, whether it's local, state, or federal, could address?
I think the forces against that kind of change are challenging. There's a lot of money to be made from a lot of people. You mentioned Schwab earlier. The commercial DAF houses, I don't know how much money they get on these DAF accounts, but these things are getting in the hundreds of billions of dollars tied up in these DAFs and other structures. And when you go to change those policies, estate attorneys, investment advisors, they all are under huge threat if you start to change the way this whole thing is structured. If more money goes out, it means assets aren't under management and people are going to lose money. So ultimately, I'm not sure it's the politicians at the moment that can do it. One thing we think about a lot at Stupski, and we're such a tiny little boat in the water, but we talk about that bigger world out there, and that bigger world are the American people. We are providing the permission to this system. the system that I follow still. There are things I'm trying to shed all the time. I'm trying to break these fake rules that we follow all the time. But it still is within a system where I play the role of a CEO with a board that plays the role of the trustee. And board dynamics have their own players that are protecting the donor in different ways. All these things are going on in this system that keep it going in this 5% way, in these structures that people dump their money into, and that benefits really the very wealthy first and foremost. And so I don't know. I think it's going to take, I do think we get to, I mean, in some ways it came from the right this last year, but there was a real threat that foundations saw in a proposed excise tax in the big, beautiful bill that would have taxed the earnings on the endowment. I mean, talk about, they really were like, we're just going to take a little bit more. But man, the foundations freaked out. They mobilized. That was going on behind the scenes, full mobilization in the Senate and elsewhere to lobby to fight that excise tax, which in effect would have had in my opinion, very limited impact. But I do think it was a signal that Americans are going to start wondering, what are you going to start doing with that money piling up, especially as we creep over 40 trillion, 41 trillion, 42 trillion in debt. Does it make sense to have that kind of debt and have 18 trillion sitting in a slush fund over on the side? Like, shouldn't that be used for something? So I do think the pressures are going to grow if we don't change our practices in the sector, and then maybe we'll start to see some policy change.
Glenn, this is awesome, and I know we're only scratching the surface, but I hope it directs more people to not only read what you're posting about and pay attention to what you're doing at the foundation, but to listen to the podcast. So where can people hear more about what you're talking about, hear these conversations?
Well, thank you for that. We have a channel on YouTube. Stepsky has a channel. The show is called Break Fake Rules. We are starting our third season of it next. I don't know when our launch date is going to be. I should probably know that, but we're moving to a new format. I'm going to have a regular co-host with me, and we will have a weekly podcast, not a monthly. So there'll be far more content and will allow us to address things in the moment more. So we're very excited about that. I put out a regular weekly newsletter called Who Gives? And you can get that on Substack. I love people signing up for that. It's free. And please sign up, share it. It's been a tremendous joy to get to write and be involved with Who Gives? And I have a book coming out in March, and that will drop on March 17th. The title of the book is Control: Why Big Giving Falls Short. So some of the things I've gotten into you'll see in the book, but it's the first time a CEO of a sitting foundation has written a book that is critically constructive or constructively critical of the sector. And Wiley, the publisher, seems very excited about it, and we are too. So I hope everyone will buy it and pass it along to their relatives. It'll be an opportunity to really see the inside of the foundation world and to think about ways that you can give differently than maybe the way you think about giving now, no matter how much you give.
Thank you so much for that, Glenn. Really appreciate it. Our thanks again to Glenn for sharing his insights on spending down at foundations. And that's a wrap on this episode and on our very first year of Frontlines of Social Good, the newest program in the 10th season of the Philanthropy Mastermind series. Over the past months, we've covered real-time forces shaping our sector, presidential actions and executive orders with Tracy Kronzak and Tiffany Gorley Carter, higher education, NGOs, and ethical storytelling with Jessica Blake, Paul Clollery, and Carly Euler, the pivot to women-centered philanthropy with Anne Murphy, donor and staff retention, threats to journalism and public broadcasting, global giving, and many other stories with many, many guests. Yes, and even our annual Horror Stories of Fundraising and Philanthropy. We've explored big questions, or at least we've tried to, including the $100 trillion wealth transfer, the future of AI, where boards have been hiding, and whether foundations should spend down, as we talked about today. To all of our guests, thank you for your insight and your willingness to speak plainly. And to all of you watching, thank you for showing up, asking tough questions, and helping shape the conversations this sector needs and this program desires. If you missed any of these episodes or want to revisit a favorite, you'll find every recording on DonorSearch.net under Resources and on the DonorSearch YouTube channel. We'll be back again in January with even more urgent topics and fearless voices. Until then, I'm Jay Frost. This is Frontlines of Social Good. Happy holidays, everyone. Stay well, and we'll look forward to seeing you in 2026.